Welcome to Betrayed Hearts Chronicles. Started like most things in life, quietly, without warning. Looking back, I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment our lives shifted, but if I had to choose, it was the day Ethan Hart moved into the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Ethan had a way about him, tall, broad-shouldered, with a rugged charm that made him an instant favorite among the women in the neighborhood. His easy smile and penchant for lending a hand with whatever needed fixing made him seem almost too good to be true. At first, I liked him well enough. He was friendly without being intrusive, always willing to chat about the weather, local sports, or the best way to patch up a cracked fence. Our lives were simple then. I'd retired from the military a year prior and was adjusting to civilian life as a security consultant. My wife, Emily, was the perfect image of a suburban homemaker, kind, supportive, and deeply involved in community activities. Together, we were raising our two kids, Abby and Dylan, and navigating the predictable chaos of family life. When Ethan moved in, Emily was one of the first to welcome him. She'd baked her signature chocolate chip cookies and brought them over with Abby in tow. Later that evening, she came home gushing about how Ethan had just moved here after a messy divorce and was trying to start fresh with his son, Mason, a quiet boy about Dylan's age. "He's so nice, Nathan," she'd said, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. "He's going to fit right in." And he did. Over the next few weeks, Ethan integrated seamlessly into our tight-knit cul-de-sac. He organized a neighborhood barbecue, helped Mrs. Lacey fix her leaky roof, and even set up a basketball hoop for the kids at the park. I appreciated his enthusiasm. It wasn't every day someone was willing to give so much to the community without expecting anything in return. But then, little things started to gnaw at me. The first instance was minor, so small it seemed ridiculous to dwell on. Ethan had come over one Saturday morning to borrow my drill. Emily answered the door while I was out back mowing the lawn. When I came inside for a glass of water, I caught them in the kitchen, laughing over something I hadn't heard. Her laugh was light and carefree, the kind she used to reserve for me. When I asked what was so funny, Emily brushed it off. "Oh, nothing," she said, handing me a glass. "Ethan was just telling me about this time he tried to build a birdhouse and ended up nailing his hand to the workbench." I laughed too. It was hard not to. But something about the way her eyes lingered on him as he left the room made my stomach twist. I told myself I was overreacting. She was just being friendly like she always was. Still, I started noticing other things. Emily began spending more time on the community beautification project she'd spearheaded, a neighborhood initiative to clean up the park and plant a community garden. Ethan had volunteered to help. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, she'd been passionate about the project long before Ethan arrived. But her late nights at the park, the way she came home with dirt smudged on her cheeks and a satisfied smile, started to feel different. One evening, I decided to stop by the park after work. I told myself it was to surprise her, maybe bring her a coffee and catch up on the progress. When I got there, I saw her and Ethan crouched side by the flower beds, heads bent close together. They were laughing again, and though there was nothing overtly inappropriate about their interaction, I couldn't shake the tightness in my chest. When I approached, Emily's expression shifted. Not guilt exactly, but something close. She stood quickly, brushing the dirt from her hands onto her jeans. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Just thought I'd bring you some coffee," I replied, holding up the cup like a peace offering. Ethan straightened up beside her, smiling in that easygoing way of his. "Nathan," he said warmly, wiping his hands on his pants. "You've got a good one here. Emily's been working her butt off out here. This place is going to look amazing. She's always been good at making things beautiful," I said, forcing a smile. Emily's cheeks flushed, and for a moment, no one said anything. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a flicker of jealousy. But I pushed it down. I trusted Emily. We'd been through too much together for me to believe she'd betray me over some neighborhood handyman. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of our lives, like a current pulling us toward an unseen rift. The days stretched into weeks, and Ethan's presence became a constant hum in the background of our lives. He'd stop by to chat with Emily when I wasn't around, help her carry groceries from the car, or offer to watch the kids while she ran errands. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. After all, he'd become a fixture in everyone's life on the cul-de-sac. But at night, as I lay beside Emily in the quiet of our room, I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was imagining the growing distance between us. She was still loving, still attentive, but there was a part of her that felt elsewhere. And then came the incident with the fence. One Saturday, while fixing a section of our backyard fence that had come loose in a storm, Ethan stopped by with his toolbox, offering to help. I wasn't in the mood for company, but I didn't want to be rude, so I accepted. We worked side by side, making small talk about the neighborhood and the kids. He was good with his hands, efficient and methodical. "You've got a nice family, Nathan," he said as we finished up, his tone casual but with an undertone I couldn't place. "Thanks," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow. "We've been lucky." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the house where Emily stood by the kitchen window, watching us. "Yeah, lucky." I followed his gaze, and for a split second, I saw it. The look in his eyes wasn't admiration or friendliness. It was hunger. That night, as Emily slept beside me, I stared into the dark, trying to quiet the storm brewing in my mind. Something was happening, something I couldn't yet define. But one thing was clear: Ethan Hart wasn't just fixing fences. He was tearing something apart, piece by piece. And I wasn't sure I could stop it. The first time I noticed it, it didn't feel like much. Just a passing moment, easy to dismiss. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those perfect days where the sunlight hit the backyard just right, making everything feel warmer, softer, less complicated. Emily and I had invited a few neighbors over to enjoy the weather. Ethan, of course, was among them. We were all gathered on the patio, the kids running around with Mason and Dylan leading a makeshift soccer game on the lawn. Emily was at the grill, flipping burgers with that effortless grace she brought to everything she did. Ethan was beside her, handing her plates and laughing at something she'd said. I stood near the cooler, talking to one of the neighbors about their recent trip to Colorado, when I saw it. Ethan reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emily's face. It was quick, almost imperceptible, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she laughed and continued her conversation, as though nothing unusual had happened. For a moment, I felt a tightness in my chest, a knot I couldn't quite untangle. But then someone called my name, and I turned away, forcing a smile as I rejoined the conversation. I told myself I was imagining things. People brushed hair from faces all the time. It wasn't a big deal, right? The second time was harder to ignore. Emily had been spending more time at the park lately, coordinating the final stages of the community garden project. She'd always been passionate about her volunteer work, but now it seemed to consume her. I chalked it up to her wanting everything to be perfect. That was just who she was. One evening, I decided to bring her dinner, thinking it might be a nice surprise. I stopped by our favorite Thai place, grabbed her usual green curry with extra spice, and headed to the park. When I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the flower beds and newly installed benches. I spotted Emily near the gazebo, her back to me, talking to Ethan. They were standing closer than I liked, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that felt intimate. He reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as he leaned in to say something. She laughed, that same carefree laugh I'd heard in the kitchen weeks ago, and tilted her head just slightly toward him. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the bag of food growing heavier in my hand. For a second, I considered turning around, pretending I hadn't seen them. But then Emily glanced up and spotted me. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she waved me over. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" she called out, her voice bright but with an edge of surprise. "Thought you might be hungry," I said, holding up the bag. "Figured I'd bring you something." Ethan stepped back, his hand dropping from her shoulder as I approached. "Hey, Nathan," he said, flashing me that easygoing grin. "You've got good timing." Emily was just saying how hungry she was. Emily shot him a quick look, something between irritation and amusement, before taking the bag from me. "That's sweet of you," she said, her smile warm but not quite reaching her eyes. "I'll leave you two to it," Ethan said, clapping me on the shoulder as he walked past. "See you around, Nathan." I watched him go, my fists clenching at my sides. When I turned back to Emily, she was already unpacking the food, her movements hurried. "He's really committed to this project," I said, keeping my tone casual. "He's been a big help," she replied without looking up. "Seems like it." She glanced at me then, her expression guarded. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Just, he's around a lot." "Nathan," she sighed, setting down the container of curry. "He's a friend. That's all. You don't have to read into everything." I nodded, swallowing the words bubbling up in my throat. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking things. But as we sat there eating in silence, the tension between us was undeniable. The third time, there was no denying it. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and the kids were playing in the sprinklers while Emily and I sat on the porch, sipping lemonade. Ethan came by to drop off some tools I'd lent him, and Emily offered him a glass. He stayed longer than necessary, leaning against the porch railing and chatting about Mason's latest school project. At one point, Emily reached out to swat at a mosquito on Ethan's arm, her hand lingering just a beat too long. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The way her fingers brushed his skin, the slight flush in her cheeks when she realized I was watching. Later that night, as we got ready for bed, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Do you think you spend a lot of time with Ethan?" I asked, my voice steady but tight. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the drawer where she kept her nightgowns. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's over here a lot. You're at the park with him all the time. It feels like, I don't know, like he's more than just a neighbor." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to snap at me. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Nathan, he's been through a lot. He's new here, trying to find his place. I'm just being friendly. Can't you trust me?" I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But that knot in my chest wouldn't loosen. "I do trust you," I said, even as the words felt hollow. She climbed into bed without another word, turning her back to me. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from us, and I didn't know how to stop it. The night it all began to fall apart was supposed to be a simple evening. Emily had been working tirelessly on the community garden project, and the team had decided to celebrate their progress with a small dinner at Bella's Bistro, the only restaurant in town that could pass for upscale. She'd been talking about it for weeks, gushing over the menu and what she planned to wear. "Do you think this dress is too much?" she asked as she stepped into our bedroom, holding up a dark green cocktail dress I hadn't seen in years. It hugged her curves, accentuating the softness of her figure in a way that took me back to when we'd first met. "You'll be the most beautiful woman there," I said, trying to ignore the pang of unease in my chest. She smiled at my compliment, but there was something distant in her expression, as if her mind was elsewhere. When the evening came, I stayed home with the kids. Abby and Dylan were easy enough to entertain with a movie and popcorn, but I couldn't shake the restless energy gnawing at me. Emily had left in a flurry, her perfume lingering in the air long after she'd gone. I told myself she deserved a night out. She worked hard for the neighborhood, for our family. But the way she'd looked at herself in the mirror before leaving, a look I hadn't seen her give in years, left me uneasy. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call her, just to check in. The phone rang several times before she picked up, her voice breathless and tinged with laughter. "Hey, Nathan," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah. Just wondering when you'll be home." "Oh, we're still here," she replied, her voice muffled, as though she'd stepped away from a noisy room. "I'm not sure how late it'll go. Don't wait up for me." I wanted to ask who we referred to, but I stopped myself. It was a community dinner. Of course Ethan would be there. Still, the knot in my stomach tightened. Emily didn't come home until nearly midnight. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, but the sound of the front door opening jolted me awake. She stepped inside, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. "You're still up?" she asked, surprised. "Yeah. How was it?" "It was nice," she said quickly, slipping off her heels. "Everyone had a great time. I'm exhausted, though. I'm just going to head to bed." She leaned down to kiss my forehead, but the gesture felt perfunctory, almost rehearsed. As she disappeared up the stairs, I caught a faint whiff of something on her clothes. Not her usual perfume, but a subtle, musky scent that didn't belong to her. The next day, Ethan came by the house. It wasn't unusual. He'd become a regular fixture, always dropping by with some excuse to talk to Emily or borrow a tool. This time, he brought a bottle of wine. "Hey, Nathan," he said, flashing that easy smile of his. "I wanted to drop this off as a thank you for letting Emily do so much for the community. She's been incredible." I stared at the bottle, a mid-tier red with a label I didn't recognize. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, my voice even. "But you didn't have to do that." "It's the least I can do," he replied, glancing past me toward the kitchen, where Emily was making lunch. "She's a gem, you know? You're a lucky guy." The comment felt loaded, but I didn't rise to it. Instead, I thanked him again and watched as he sauntered back down the driveway, whistling a tune I couldn't place. That evening, I couldn't get the image of them together at Bella's Bistro out of my mind. I hadn't asked for details about the dinner, but something inside me burned to know more. When Emily stepped into the shower, I saw my opportunity. Her phone was on the nightstand, unlocked. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the device. We'd always trusted each other. Snooping felt like crossing a line, but something deeper, darker, drove me. I picked it up and scrolled through her messages. There it was. A conversation with Ethan. "Ethan, last night was great. You looked stunning in that dress." Emily, "Thanks, Ethan. It was nice to unwind a little." Ethan, "I'd say more than nice. You have a way of lighting up a room, you know that?" Her reply was a simple smiley face. Harmless on the surface, but the implication sent my mind racing. I heard the water stop in the bathroom and quickly set the phone down, my heart pounding. That night I barely slept. Every glance, every smile, every subtle touch between them played on a loop in my mind. The casual intimacy of their messages felt like a betrayal, even if nothing explicit had been said. By morning, I'd resolved to confront her. But when I saw her bustling around the kitchen, pouring cereal for the kids and humming softly to herself, I faltered. What if I was wrong? What if my insecurities were blowing things out of proportion? But the doubt lingered, festering beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would finally erupt. It happened on a Wednesday evening, one of those nights where everything seemed painfully normal. The kids were upstairs doing homework, the faint sounds of pencils scratching paper and calculators beeping drifting down the hall. I was in the living room, flipping through channels, the remote heavy in my hand as my mind wandered. Emily had told me she was heading to the park to check on the community garden. She hadn't asked if I wanted to come. By now, I'd stopped asking questions. The tension between us had become a constant presence, like a low hum in the background of our lives. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to find if I started digging. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't plan to follow her. It was impulsive, driven by the gnawing doubt that had taken root in my chest. As her car pulled out of the driveway, I waited just long enough to not seem obvious, then grabbed my keys and slipped out the door. I'd become adept at justifying my actions to myself. This was about reassurance, I told myself, about proving that everything was fine. When I reached the park, I parked on the far end of the lot, hidden in the shadows. Emily's car was there, but the place looked deserted. I'd expected to find her near the flower beds or the gazebo, where she usually worked, but as I walked deeper into the park, a different scene unfolded. The soft glow of the gazebo lights cast long shadows on the grass. Emily was there, standing close to Ethan. Too close. He was leaning against one of the wooden posts, his body angled toward her, his hand brushing against her arm as he spoke. She laughed, her voice low and warm, the sound carrying on the night air. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Part of me wanted to storm over, to demand an explanation, but my legs wouldn't move. I watched as Ethan's hand slid down her arm to her hand, his fingers curling around hers. She didn't pull away. "You're incredible, Emily," he said, his voice soft but audible in the stillness of the park. "Do you know that, Ethan?" she murmured, her tone carrying a mix of hesitation and something else, something I couldn't bring myself to name. "I mean it," he said, stepping closer. "You deserve to feel appreciated, to feel wanted." Her silence spoke louder than any words could. Then, before I could fully process what was happening, Ethan leaned in. His lips brushed against hers, tentative at first, as if testing the waters. Emily's body stiffened, but only for a moment. Then she melted into him, her hands coming to rest on his chest as the kiss deepened. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My chest felt hollow, the air stolen from my lungs. I wanted to look away, to turn and leave, but I was rooted to the spot, a voyeur to my own heartbreak. They pulled apart after what felt like an eternity but was likely only seconds. Emily's face was flushed, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It feels right to me," Ethan replied, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She stepped back, her arms wrapping around herself as if trying to shield against the weight of what had just happened. "I can't do this," she said, shaking her head. I need to go." Ethan didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, watching as she turned and hurried toward the parking lot. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding as she passed by, her face a mix of guilt and confusion. I stayed in the park long after she'd gone, long after Ethan had walked back to his truck and driven away. The darkness felt suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. When I finally did, it was nearly midnight. The house was silent when I returned, the kids fast asleep, Emily already in bed. I stood in the doorway of our room, staring at her as she lay curled on her side, her back to me. I wanted to wake her, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and went downstairs, sinking into the couch. My mind raced, replaying what I'd seen over and over until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. The next morning, Emily was her usual self, bustling around the kitchen, making breakfast for the kids. She kissed me on the cheek as if nothing had happened, as if the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But I couldn't unsee it, couldn't erase the image of her in Ethan's arms. "You okay?" she asked, noticing my silence. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." She nodded, accepting my answer without question. But as she turned back to the stove, I couldn't help but wonder how long this facade could last. How long I could pretend that everything was fine while my world crumbled around me. Something had broken between us, something I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. And for the first time I found myself questioning not just her, but myself. What would I do now? What could I do knowing the truth? I'd always thought betrayal would come with thunderclaps, a dramatic upheaval that you couldn't ignore. But in the days that followed the night in the park, it came quietly. Life went on, deceptively normal on the surface, while beneath it, a riptide pulled me farther from Emily. She didn't know what I'd seen, or if she did, she didn't show it. She still smiled when she passed me my coffee in the mornings, still kissed my cheek before heading out the door. But there was a crack in the foundation of our life together, and I couldn't ignore it. Ethan's presence in our lives didn't diminish. If anything, it increased. He'd stop by under the pretense of borrowing tools or bringing something for the kids. Emily would act as if nothing was amiss, her laughter ringing out as she talked to him on the porch or in the kitchen. Each time, I'd find myself watching them, searching for signs. A touch too lingering, a glance too long. And I found them. It wasn't long before I noticed patterns. Emily's trips to the park became more frequent. She'd leave just after dinner, claiming she needed to check on the garden or finalize details for the next community event. At first, I tried to convince myself that her dedication was admirable. But the gnawing doubt inside me refused to let it go. One night, I decided to follow her again. I waited until her car disappeared around the corner before grabbing my keys. This time, I didn't park at the lot. Instead, I stayed on the street, far enough away to avoid being seen but close enough to watch. She wasn't at the garden. Instead, her car was parked at the far end of the park, near the trailhead that led to the woods. A few minutes later, Ethan's truck pulled up beside hers. My chest tightened as I watched him climb out and walk toward her car. She stepped out, her figure silhouetted by the faint glow of the street lamp. They exchanged a few words before walking together into the woods, their voices too low for me to hear. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to get out and follow them, to confront them right then and there. But another part, the part ruled by fear and uncertainty, kept me rooted in place. They were gone for nearly an hour. When they emerged, they were laughing, their heads close together as if sharing a secret. Ethan's hand rested lightly on her lower back as he walked her to her car. She didn't pull away. I drove home before they noticed me, my thoughts racing. By the time Emily returned, I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read a book. She came in, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. "How was the park?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Good," she replied quickly, slipping off her shoes. "We got a lot done." Me and a couple of the volunteers," she said, her tone breezy. "You know how it is." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. Her lies were so effortless, so natural, that I almost admired her for it. Almost. The following week, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed proof, something tangible to confirm what I already knew in my gut. I bought a small recording device and hid it in her car, tucked beneath the driver's seat. Felt invasive, wrong even, but I was past the point of caring. Days passed and I waited. Each time she left for the park, I'd sit in the living room, my hands clenched into fists as I imagined what might be happening. When she returned, I'd retrieve the device and listen to the recordings. At first, there was nothing but the mundane sounds of her starting the car or music playing softly in the background. But then, one evening, I heard it. Her voice, low and soft, filled the car. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said. Ethan's voice followed, calm and soothing. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just take it one day at a time." "It's not that simple," she replied. "Nathan, he's been so distant lately. I feel like I'm suffocating." "You deserve to be happy, Emily," Ethan said. "Don't forget that." There was a pause, filled only by the faint hum of the car engine. Then I heard her sigh. "I should go home." "If that's what you want," Ethan said, though his tone suggested otherwise. The recording ended, leaving me staring at the device in my hand. My chest felt heavy, as if all the air had been sucked from the room. Confronting her still felt impossible. Each time I tried, the words died on my tongue. Instead, I carried the weight of what I knew, letting it fester inside me. I started avoiding Ethan, finding excuses to leave the room whenever he stopped by. Emily noticed, of course, but she didn't press me about it. Maybe she was too wrapped up in her own guilt, or maybe she didn't care. Our nights became quieter, our conversations more stilted. I couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at me the way she looked at him. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. The regular meetings continued, each one a dagger to the fragile trust I'd once had in her. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to confront her. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't ready to face what came next. The day everything escalated started like any other. Emily was in the kitchen making breakfast, the kids chattering about their upcoming school projects. I stood by the counter, sipping my coffee and trying to seem normal. The weight of what I'd learned sat heavy on my chest, threatening to spill out at any moment. But I wasn't ready, not yet. It was a Saturday, which meant Emily would spend the day at the park. She told me as much over breakfast, her tone casual, as though her plans were routine. I nodded, my expression neutral, even as my insides twisted. I'd stopped asking questions by then. Each lie she told me felt like a test, and I'd grown tired of failing them. Later that afternoon, I found myself pacing the living room, the walls closing in around me. Emily had left hours ago, and the kids were at a friend's house. The silence in the house was deafening. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through the contacts until I reached Ethan's name. My finger hovered over it. A part of me tempted to call him to demand answers. But what good would it do? He'd deny it just as she would. And then what? Instead, I decided to drive to the park. This time, I didn't bother with subtlety. I parked near the entrance and headed straight for the wooded trail where I'd seen them disappear before. The air was cool, the faint scent of pine mixing with the damp earth beneath my feet. My heart pounded as I walked, each step taking me closer to the truth I both craved and feared. As I neared the clearing, voices drifted toward me, low and muffled but unmistakable. I slowed, my breath catching in my throat. Peering through the trees, I saw them. Ethan and Emily were standing close, their heads bent together as they spoke. His hand rested on her waist, his thumb grazing the fabric of her sweater. She wasn't pulling away. If anything, she seemed to lean into him. And then it happened. Ethan's hand moved to her face, his fingers tracing her cheek before tilting her chin upward. Their lips met, the kiss slow and deliberate, filled with an intimacy that should have been mine. My chest burned, a mix of rage and heartbreak threatening to consume me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, the scene before me playing out like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Then something inside me snapped. I don't remember grabbing the rock. It was just there, solid and heavy in my hand. My feet moved on their own, carrying me into the clearing. The sound of my footsteps startled them, and they broke apart, their faces flushed with shock. "Nathan!" Emily's voice trembled, her eyes wide as she stepped back from Ethan. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. My focus was on Ethan, his expression shifting from surprise to something resembling fear as he took a step back. "Nathan, wait," he said, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "This isn't what it looks like." The rage coursing through me drowned out his words. My grip tightened around the rock, my arm trembling as I raised it. Emily's voice cut through the haze, sharp and panicked. "Nathan, stop!" Her scream jolted me back to reality, the weight of the rock suddenly too much to bear. I dropped it, the sound of it hitting the ground loud in the tense silence. My chest heaved as I stared at them, their faces pale and stricken. "How long?" My voice was low, trembling with the effort to keep it steady. "How long has this been going on?" Emily opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Ethan took a step forward, his hands still raised. "Nathan, I think we should talk about this," he said carefully. "Shut up," I snapped, my voice rising. "This isn't about you. This is between me and her." Emily flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks as she finally found her voice. "Nathan, please. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I demanded, my anger boiling over. "For you to betray me? To destroy our family?" I don't know," she sobbed. It just happened." Her words felt like a slap, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. My hands trembled as I ran them through my hair, trying to make sense of the chaos in my mind. Ethan shifted behind me, his presence like a thorn in my side. "Nathan, I'm sorry. I never meant." "I told you to shut up," I said, spinning to face him. "You've done enough." He held my gaze for a moment before nodding, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Emily's sobs filled the void, her body trembling as she tried to approach me. "Nathan, please. We can fix this. We can." "Don't," I said, my voice hollow. "Just don't." I walked away then, leaving her standing in the clearing. My mind was a storm of anger, betrayal, and a pain so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there. Not with her. Not after what I'd seen. As I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, I realized something. This was just the beginning. The days following that confrontation blurred together in a haze of anger, confusion, and exhaustion. I stayed away from Emily as much as I could, crashing on the couch or disappearing into the garage for hours. The kids noticed, of course. Abby asked if I was mad at Mommy, her big brown eyes full of concern. I lied, telling her everything was fine. But nothing about our lives felt fine anymore. Emily tried to talk to me several times. Each attempt ended in frustration and tears, hers or mine, usually both. The words I wanted to say eluded me, tangled in the knot of emotions choking me every time I saw her. All I could hear were her whispers to Ethan, her laughter, her gasps as his hands touched her. The memory of it haunted me, a constant loop I couldn't escape. The breaking point came one evening when I returned home to find Emily waiting for me in the living room. She looked pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and a manila envelope sat on the coffee table in front of her. My stomach twisted. Something was coming, something big. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Do we?" I replied, my tone sharp. I didn't sit. Couldn't. My body thrummed with nervous energy. "Please, Nathan. Just sit down." Reluctantly, I did. The envelope seemed to glare at me, its presence heavy and ominous. Emily took a deep breath, her hands wringing together in her lap. "There's something you need to know," she began. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." "Is this about Ethan?" I asked, my voice laced with bitterness. "Because I think I've seen enough." Her face crumpled, but she pushed forward. "It's not just about him. It's bigger than that." My heart pounded as she picked up the envelope and held it out to me. I hesitated before taking it, my fingers trembling. Inside were several documents, medical forms, legal papers, and a letter written in Emily's neat handwriting. Confused, I began to read. The words hit me like a freight train. Ethan wasn't just her lover. He was Dylan's biological father. "What is this?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, but the anger beneath it was palpable. Emily's hands twisted in her lap, her face a mask of guilt and shame. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. "It happened years ago, before we even moved here. I made a mistake, Nathan. A terrible mistake." "A mistake," I said, my voice rising. "You had a child with another man and didn't think I deserved to know?" Tears streamed down her face. "I thought it was over. Ethan didn't want to be involved. He signed the papers, gave up his rights. You've been Dylan's father in every way that matters. I didn't think it would ever come up again. Until he moved in down the street." I spat. "And now what? You just couldn't help yourself? Did he come back for you or for Dylan?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Maybe both. I don't know what's real anymore. I'm so sorry, Nathan." Her apology felt hollow, a drop of water in an ocean of betrayal. I stood abruptly, pacing the room as my mind raced. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, my life, it was all a lie. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the garage, the envelope clutched in my hands, staring at the evidence of Emily's infidelity and the secret she'd kept for so long. The pieces began to fall into place. Dylan's dark hair and striking blue eyes that never quite matched mine or Emily's. The way Ethan had taken a particular interest in him from the start. I thought about confronting Dylan, about telling him the truth. But how could I? He was just a kid. My kid. He didn't deserve to have his world torn apart because of Emily's mistakes. The next morning, Emily tried to talk to me again, but I couldn't face her. I left the house before the kids woke up and drove aimlessly for hours. By the time I returned, Ethan was there. His truck was parked in the driveway, and he was standing on the porch, talking to Emily. My blood boiled at the sight of him, but I stayed in the car, watching from a distance. When he left, Emily came inside, her expression weary. "We have to figure this out," she said, her voice heavy with resignation. "There's nothing to figure out," I said coldly. "You made your choices. Now we have to live with them." Her eyes filled with tears, But I didn't stay to watch her break down. I walked upstairs, shutting the door to our bedroom behind me. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The revelation didn't just crack our marriage. It shattered it. Every interaction with Emily became a battle. Every glance at Dylan a reminder of the truth I couldn't escape. And Ethan? He lingered in the background, a constant presence that only deepened the wound. I didn't know how much more I could take. But one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The day Emily and I sat across from each other at the lawyer's office felt surreal. The polished wood desk between us might as well have been a canyon, wide and impossible to cross. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wedding ring still on her finger, though its glint felt more like mockery now. I'd stopped wearing mine weeks ago. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Grace Andrews, explained the terms of the agreement. Her voice was steady, professional, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Maybe she had. For me, though, this was uncharted territory. I'd spent years building a life with Emily, only to watch it crumble into ashes. "You'll retain joint custody of the children," Grace said, her pen tapping softly against the edge of the table. "Primary residence will remain with Mrs. Grant, but Mr. Grant will have visitation rights every other weekend and on alternating holidays." I nodded mechanically, the words washing over me without sinking in. It felt like a script written for someone else's life, not mine. Emily's eyes flicked to mine, searching for something. Understanding, forgiveness, I didn't know. I refused to meet her gaze. The weeks leading up to this moment had been hell. After the revelation about Dylan's parentage, our marriage had become a battlefield. Every conversation devolved into an argument. Every interaction laced with bitterness and regret. I tried, for the sake of the kids, to keep things civil. But how could I, when every glance at Emily reminded me of her betrayal, of the life she'd built on lies? The final blow came when Ethan showed up at our house one evening. He'd come to talk. His tone calm and conciliatory, as though he thought this could all be resolved like some petty misunderstanding. I'd nearly lost it then, my anger spilling over in a torrent of words I barely remembered later. Emily had stood between us, her face pale, her voice trembling as she begged us to stop. That night, I told her it was over. Now, here we were, dissecting our life together into legal jargon and financial terms. Grace continued outlining the agreement, her words clinical and detached. "The marital home will be sold, and the proceeds divided equally," she said. "Any shared debts will also be split 50-50. Emily's voice was soft when she spoke. "What about the kids? How do we explain this to them?" I finally looked at her then, my jaw tight. "You explain it. You tell them why their family is falling apart." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it was fleeting, drowned out by the sea of anger and resentment that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. Grace cleared her throat, her expression impassive. "That's something you'll need to discuss outside of this room. My role here is to finalize the legal aspects of the dissolution." Dissolution. Such a tidy word for the chaos our lives had become. The next few weeks passed in a blur of packing boxes and whispered conversations with the kids. Abby cried when we told her. Dylan, ever the stoic one, simply nodded and went to his room. I'd stood outside his door that night, my hand hovering over the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. What could I say to him? How could I explain a truth that I barely understood myself? Moving day came, and the house felt emptier than it ever had, even though most of our belongings were still there. Emily and I avoided each other, our interactions reduced to curt exchanges about logistics. When the moving truck finally pulled away, I stood in the driveway, staring at the place that had been our home. It looked the same, but it wasn't. Not anymore. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just 2 bedrooms and a cramped living room, but it was mine. The silence was both a relief and a torment. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying everything that had led us here, trying to pinpoint the moment when it all went wrong. Ethan didn't stay in the neighborhood. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I heard he'd sold his house and moved back to wherever he'd come from. Good riddance. But his absence didn't fill the void he'd left behind. If anything, it made it worse, leaving me with nothing but questions and memories. The kids adjusted in their own ways. Abby was quieter, more withdrawn, while Dylan's stoicism deepened into something harder, more unyielding. I tried to be there for them, to make our weekends together as normal as possible. But there was no normal anymore. Not for us. Emily, I'd like to say I forgave her, that we found a way to coexist for the sake of the kids. But the truth is, I didn't. Maybe someday I will. Maybe time will dull the edges of this pain, smoothing it into something I can live with. But for now, every interaction with her feels like salt in an open wound. As I sit here, in this too small apartment with its peeling paint and leaky faucet, I can't help but wonder what the future holds. For me, for the kids, even for Emily. I've lost so much, but I'm still here, still standing. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough for now. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.